Nothing to cook in the house? Think again, because if you've got onion, potatoes, and eggs, you've got everything you need to cook a delicious Italian frittata. Welcome to Actually Italian. I'm Sal, and I've been living in Italy for years now. I'm really excited to teach you some authentic recipes to help you learn how to cook like an actual Italian. There are some foods that I call blank slate dishes. For instance, pasta is a blank slate. Risotto is a blank slate. It's a base that you can use for anything. Frittata is the same way. You can put whatever you want in it, so it's just eggs. It's essentially an Italian omelet with a few differences. The version I'm going to make today is a classic. You'll find it all over Italy. It's very similar to a Spanish tortilla. We're going to use potatoes and onion for this one. And that's how I really grew up eating it. We tried different variations all the time, but the one that was most consistent was with potatoes and onions. In fact, I remember very clearly being sent off to elementary school with my bagged lunch of a frittata sandwich. Anyway, it's as simple as it gets, so let's dive in and get started. I'll start with prepping the potatoes and then the onions. I'm using a Yukon Gold style potato, which I think is the right type for this recipe. That's because it's going to hold its shape. It's not going to turn into like mashed potatoes as this whole thing cooks. I'm just going to cut it into medium-sized pieces. That way they'll be nice and crispy on the outside and fluffy inside. I'm picking a red onion here for this. You can use really any type, but I think ones that are going to add a little bit of sweetness to the finished product are really the best. So red onion, some yellow onions. I'm going to slice this not too thinly, but I don't want to make it like into cubes or dice or anything like that, because then it'll kind of dissolve into the dish and you won't even really know it's there. With that done, we're going to head to the stove where I've got a wide-bodied pan, non-stick, filled with some hot oil. I've got this over medium-high heat to test to make sure that it's hot enough. I just throw a little piece of potato in there, and then once it's sizzling, I know it's ready and I can put the rest of the potatoes in. I just want to give it a stir once in a while just to make sure they're not sticking together and are cooking evenly. We want to see some nice browning happen. When they look like this, where they're pretty brown and they're tender inside, that's when they're done. Now I'll just scoop them out of the pan with the spider so that way as much oil can drain off as possible. I am salting the potatoes while they're set aside also, because potatoes do need a good amount of salt. If we salt everything individually, it's going to make sure that the whole dish is salted and seasoned perfectly. I drained most of the oil and we're going to put the onions right in here now, same pan. Just a little bit of salt, a tiny bit, just to get them softened up. Just give it a stir and just let it cook. It takes about maybe 10 minutes. We're not looking to do 30-minute caramelized onions here. We just want to give them a little bit of depth of flavor. These are done now, so I'm going to set these aside as well. We want the onions and the potatoes to be not too hot because we're going to add them directly into the beaten eggs. We don't want the eggs to scramble before we cook them. Now I'm going to beat the eggs and get these ready. I generally go for 2 eggs a person. More than that, and you have basically like a fluffy omelet, which is not what we're looking for. A frittata needs to be kind of compact, a little bit dense even. We don't want a lot of egg. We want just enough to kind of cover all of the ingredients that we're going to put in it. I'm also going to put some grated cheese in this. Now this probably looks like a lot of grated cheese, and that's because it is a lot of grated cheese. I love the grated cheese in this, so I tend to have a heavy hand with that. I also have a secret ingredient that I'm going to put in right now. It's not traditional, and it's something I was turned on to not that long ago. Back in the day, there was this little sandwich shop on North Street in the North End in Boston, which is Boston's Little Italy. And they did a pepper and egg sandwich that had lines out the door. They ended up closing, moving away, something like that. And a few years later, I was working as a barber in the North End, and one of the owners came in for a haircut. And so me and the other barber were talking to him about how much we loved the sandwiches at that place. And the other guy said, you know, you had that pepper and egg sandwich that was so good. What made it so good? I mean, it's just basically a pepper frittata. Why would it be so popular? And he said he had a secret ingredient that he put in there. Just a little bit of sugar. And that was what made it so extraordinary. So that's what I do now. I always add about a teaspoon of sugar. Now that the eggs are beaten well, nice and homogeneous, and we've got the cheese and the sugar in there. We're ready to add the rest of the ingredients. So we want to put the cooled potatoes and onions in here. Give it a good mix. Again, we want everything incorporated. The reason we don't do this in the pan where we put the potatoes and onion in and then pour the eggs over it is because we don't get a consistent end result that way. Everything would kind of be on the bottom with the eggs on top. We want everything mixed together. At this point, we're ready to start cooking it. I've got a pan, a nonstick pan, over what was supposed to be a medium heat. I ended up forgetting it was a little bit high. You'll see in a minute what happened. Try to push everything down a little bit and make sure that everything is pretty even. Now at a certain point, we want to start kind of making holes in here to let some of the non-cooked eggs get in there and be able to kind of cook evenly. The idea is that we want this to cook most of the way on this side before we flip it. Flipping it, I'll admit, is a little bit tricky. And this is why a lot of people end up mainly cooking it on the stove and then putting it into the oven. The problem with that is it puffs. And we're not looking for a puffy, light, fluffy omelet. We're looking for a compact frittata. So what I'm going to do is I am going to flip it back into the pan. The key to this is to use a pot lid like this one because it has a knob on it. If I were to use a plate and have my hand on the bottom of the plate when I slide the hot frittata on there, it's going to be pretty hot. This knob is going to give me something to hold on to that's not going to heat up. I'm not going to feel it. Very carefully, holding that pot lid, I'm going to slide that frittata on the top of it. Then I'm going to take another plate, a big plate that's going to cover the whole area, put it over the frittata and flip that. Now that it's flipped, I can just easily slide this right back into the pan. At this point, you can see it's a little bit overdone on the top there. It got a little bit too cooked. If I had used that medium heat, it would have been fine, but this is going to taste good anyway. Now that it's back on the heat, we only need a couple of minutes. In fact, I would shut it off after a minute of cooking and let it sit in the pan to kind of finish and cook its way through. It's mostly cooked anyway at this point. When you just cook it through, so there's no raw bits left, it's nice and silky smooth and has a fantastic texture. All right, let me give it a taste and let you know what I think. That taste brings me right back to my childhood. The only thing is I wish that my mother knew about that trick with the sugar because it really makes a huge difference. It's not sweet though. It doesn't make it sweet, it just brings like this other dimension of flavor to it. Plus you've got the sweetness of the onions and just a nice tender potato. It's fantastic. Frittata is a second course because Italians eat in courses. So if this were lunch, they would have a small plate of pasta first, then they would have this as their main course with the side of like salad or some grilled vegetables or something like that. They don't eat this hot out of the pan. They let it come down closer to room temperature. In fact, it's not even unusual to let it sit for half an hour, 45 minutes before they actually eat it. And there's a good reason for that because all the flavors really come through when you eat it closer to room temperature than if it were piping hot. Again, if you think you've got nothing to cook in the house, you can always make this frittata and it's going to be a big hit. Anyway, that's it for now and I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you in the next one.